Now, philanthropic giving has increased in the United States by 400%, but unfortunately, it's not being received by nonprofits run by people of color. Wes Moore, CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation, hopes to change that. Wes, thanks so much for joining us today. As I mentioned, giving has increased by 400%, but according to you guys, only 10% of charitable donations have gone to nonprofits led by people of color. Why is that?
Well, I think there's a whole collection of reasons why. Oftentimes, turnover of nonprofits and the supports they receive has been relatively low. So if an organization has been funded, oftentimes they continue to receive funding, making it more difficult for new organizations to be able to receive funding. But the reality is that historically, racism has been and continues to be a function of poverty. And we believe, as Robin Hood, as an organization that is focused on ending poverty as we know it, that we believe that one must address the systemic racism if we are to eradicate poverty. And when you look at where the dollars are going, and it's not even just in the world of philanthropy, frankly, even when we look at our own portfolio, we funded fewer and we funded less. And so in order to address that, it meant we had to be critical. It means we had to be self-analytical, and it means we had to really work with the field to be able to address the fact that we have leaders who are closest to the ground, really able to understand what's happening to many of these organizations and many of these communities, and really provide a unique lens as the way we're going to address it. And that's why we started the Power Fund.
So speaking of the Power Fund, exactly what is it and how is it going to work?
So the Power Fund is a new initiative to fund and elevate nonprofit leaders of color who share Robin Hood's mission of increased mobility from poverty. And this initiative really allows us to address poverty through the lens of the interplay between racial injustice and economic injustice. And so by being able to work with and support organizations, and not just financially, but also to be able to provide services and supports, management assistance, technical assistance, be able to build a pipeline. We know that as this larger social sector reinvention is taking place right now, that making sure that we have leaders of color who are supported, organizations that are led by leaders of color, is going to be incredibly important as we continue not only to functionally defend and fight our mission, but then also being able to deal with some of the other structural challenges that we continue to see within our society.
So, Wes, we talk a lot about how diversity isn't just a charitable act. It's not just a right thing to do, but frankly, for companies and businesses, it just makes good business sense for them, especially to help them in their bottom line and their profitability as they're able to have a coalition of ideas. But when it comes to the nonprofit space, how does empowering nonprofit leaders of color help when it comes to philanthropy?
Well, in many ways, it's actually a similar type of function. Right? It's understanding that funding leaders of color is going to be critical because these leaders often bring strategies, ideas, platforms that intimately understand the racialized experiences and issues that are facing communities of color. If you think about the work of Robin Hood, about 80% of the population that's living in poverty in New York City, about 80% are people of color. So when you consider the fact that only about 10% of all dollars are going to organizations that are led by people of color, we know there's a distinct challenge of being able to address those issues without their perspective as a core part of that solution set. And so the same way that corporations are saying, how can we find ways of diversifying our workforce? How are we finding ways of diversifying our vendors and our suppliers and our boards and our C-suites? We believe deeply that our nonprofit leaders, our social service leaders, the ones who are interacting with the community to address these issues that are so persistent and so damaging to our society, adding that lens of perspective to our work is just as important as any corporate leader is thinking about adding that lens to their work.
So I want to pick up on something that you said just a moment ago, that, some of these nonprofits, particularly ones led by people of color, are on the ground doing the work. And I thought here about healthcare. When we see patients, when they do not see a doctor that looks like them, they actually receive worse outcomes. Does that exist as well in the nonprofit space? If nonprofits led by people of color are not well funded, that they cannot do the work to the best of the ability, and that the whole space essentially suffers.
Yeah, I mean, we love and we cherish the fact that we have people who are focused on this issue of poverty, no matter what their background, no matter what their makeup is. Having people from different perspectives and different ideas who are working and supporting people living in poverty is important. But it's also really important for our society to recognize that race is one of the most predictable indicators of life outcomes that we have. Everything from educational attainment to income and wealth, to mental and physical health, to maternal mortality. It's impossible to separate these dynamics of race and poverty. And so it does become incredibly important that we do have that lens, that connectivity to the work, and having people who do have an intimate understanding of not just what's necessary, but also an intimate understanding of what's required. And it's part of this idea that I think we think about. It's a philosophical shift of going from sympathy to empathy, where sympathy is I'm doing this and I feel bad for that person. Empathy is their pain is our pain. And we really want to move, not just organizationally, but this space into a measure of empathetic love, because we think that's what's going to get us to our solution fastest.
So I know I'm running out of time with you, Wes, but I want to ask you about some of the initiatives that we've been seeing lately from a lot of these large corporations donating hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, when we hear the organizations that they are giving them to, they're giving it to the NAACP, they're giving it to Black Lives Matter, and other pretty large organizations. How are smaller organizations working to bridge that gap when it comes to racial inequality? And why should companies, maybe say, hey, we don't actually need to give to some of these larger organizations, but maybe we should be considering some of these smaller ones that are doing more localized work as well?
It's been incredibly empowering watching the way that many corporations have stepped up in this moment to identify how they can help philanthropically and otherwise. I mean, I think about the launch of the Power Fund at Robinhood. That includes a $10 million commitment in seed money from our organization. And also, we were both seeking partners to further capitalize the fund, but we've also have received support from our board and leadership council members that include some of the most respected financial institutions, such as Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Blue Ridge Capital, et cetera. But you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I know we think about with the Power Fund, one of the things that many people in the philanthropic world are thinking about is the organizations that are really fending for and fighting for the organizations on the ground. The ones who have the closest connection to what's happening on the ground are the ones who don't just need the support, but are going to be the ones that oftentimes are going to be the most effective. And so the way we oftentimes think about it is, how are we funding both the leaders of today, but also the leaders of tomorrow? And being able to have that philosophy, even being able to have that lens, we think is also a really important component for our corporate partners to be able to bring into their philanthropic giving.
All right, Wes Moore, Robin Hood Foundation CEO, thanks so much for today.
Thank you.